Herbie Hancock hit the wrong chord. The sound echoed through the recording studio like a gunshot. Every musician in the room froze. Miles Davis stopped playing mid-solo. For 5 seconds, nobody breathed. Herbie's career was about to end, or so he thought. What Miles did next didn't just save Herbie's job. It changed the entire philosophy of jazz forever. It was March 2nd, 1959, at Columbia Records' 30th Street studio in New York City. The session that day would produce what would eventually become the best-selling jazz album of all time, Kind of Blue. But nobody in that room knew they were making history. They just knew they were terrified of making mistakes in front of Miles Davis. Miles had a reputation that preceded him, like a storm cloud. He didn't tolerate mediocrity. He didn't accept excuses, and he absolutely did not allow mistakes during recording sessions. His previous pianist had been fired for playing a single wrong note during a live performance. Another musician had been kicked out of the band for showing up 3 minutes late to rehearsal. Miles Davis demanded perfection, and everyone knew it. So when Herbie Hancock, just 19 years old and barely 2 months into playing with Miles's quintet, hit that chord, he felt his entire world collapse. But to understand why this moment was so significant, we need to understand who Herbie Hancock was and how he ended up in that studio in the first place. Herbie had been a child prodigy. By age 11, he was performing Mozart piano concertos with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. By 16, he was studying electrical engineering at Grinnell College, while also pursuing classical music. He was the kind of genius who could have done anything: gone to MIT, become a concert pianist, invented something in a lab. But jazz called to him. The freedom of it. The conversation between musicians. The way you could say things with music that words could never capture. So he left the classical world behind and dove into jazz, practicing 12 hours a day, studying every record he could find, absorbing the language of improvisation like it was oxygen. When Miles Davis heard about this young pianist who could play anything, he invited Herbie to audition. The audition lasted about 30 seconds. Miles heard Herbie play one progression, nodded once, and said, "You start Monday." That was 6 weeks before the Kind of Blue recording session. 6 weeks of Herbie trying to prove he belonged in a room with the greatest jazz musicians alive. 6 weeks of barely sleeping, constantly worried he'd be the weak link. 6 weeks of Miles watching him with those intense, unblinking eyes, judging every note. The other musicians in the studio that day were legends in their own right. John Coltrane on saxophone, already being called the future of jazz. Cannonball Adderley, whose alto sax could make grown men cry. Paul Chambers on bass, Bill Evans on piano for some tracks, and Jimmy Cobb on drums, and of course Miles Davis on trumpet, the man who had already revolutionized jazz 3 times and was about to do it again. The pressure in that studio was immense. Columbia Records had invested significant money in this session. Miles had a specific vision for what he wanted, something modal, something that moved away from traditional chord progressions into something more open, more free. He'd sketched out rough ideas, but much of it would be improvised in the moment. That was Miles's genius. He created frameworks for freedom. They'd already recorded several takes that morning. Everything was going smoothly, too smoothly perhaps. Miles was in a rare good mood, nodding approvingly at takes, not demanding constant retakes like he usually did. The music was flowing like water, each musician intuitively understanding where the others were going. And then came the moment that would define Herbie Hancock's career. They were working on a piece that would eventually be called So What? The melody was simple, elegant, based on just 2 modes. Miles had explained the concept briefly. No complex chord changes, just 2 scales, and freedom within those constraints. Herbie was comping, providing harmonic support while Miles soloed. He was lost in the music, feeling it, responding to Miles's trumpet phrases like they were having a conversation. His fingers moved across the keys instinctively, each chord supporting and answering what Miles was playing. And then, in one moment of either inspiration or confusion, Herbie himself would never be quite sure which, his fingers landed on a chord that was completely, utterly, undeniably wrong. Not wrong in an interesting way. Not wrong in a way that could be interpreted as experimental. Just wrong. The kind of wrong that makes everyone in the room immediately recognize that a mistake has been made. A chord that clashed with everything else happening, that disrupted the harmonic structure, that felt like someone had thrown a rock through a window. The sound hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 2 seconds. Then Miles stopped playing. His trumpet lowered slowly from his lips. He turned his head toward the piano. Everyone in the studio froze. Herbie wanted to disappear. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He wanted to be anywhere else, back in Chicago with his parents, back in college, studying engineering, anywhere but in this studio where he had just ruined the most important recording session of his life. The engineer in the booth was already reaching for the button to stop the tape. John Coltrane had his eyes closed, probably already playing the next take in his mind. Cannonball Adderley looked sympathetic. He'd been there before, he understood. Bill Evans, sitting next to Herbie at the second piano, gave him a look that said, "It happens, but it's going to be rough." Miles Davis stood there in the middle of the studio, trumpet in his hand, looking at Herbie with those intense dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The silence was suffocating. Herbie started to say something, an apology, an explanation, anything to break the tension, but Miles held up one hand, a gesture that meant, wait. And then Miles Davis did something that nobody in that studio had ever seen him do during a recording session. He smiled. Not a big smile, not a grin, just a small, knowing smile that suggested he knew something that nobody else in the room understood yet. Miles raised his trumpet back to his lips, and then he played 4 notes, 4 simple notes that somehow, impossibly, made Herbie's wrong chord make sense. They didn't erase the mistake. They embraced it, built on it, transformed it from an error into a new direction. The other musicians, understanding what Miles was doing, immediately joined in. Coltrane found a line that wove around both Miles's new phrase and Herbie's chord. Chambers walked the bass in a way that grounded everything. Cobb kept the rhythm steady, the heartbeat that held it all together. And suddenly, magically, what had been a mistake became the most interesting moment in the entire piece. The wrong chord created a tension that Miles resolved in a way that was more beautiful than if Herbie had played the right chord. The music took on a depth, a humanity, a sense of real conversation between musicians that couldn't have been planned. They played through to the end of the take. When the final note faded, there was a moment of silence. Then Miles lowered his trumpet, looked at the engineer in the booth, and said 2 words, "Keep it." The room erupted in a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Keep it. Keep the take with the obvious mistake. The engineer looked uncertain. This wasn't how Miles Davis usually worked. Usually anything less than perfect was discarded immediately. But Miles wasn't done teaching. He walked over to where Herbie sat at the piano, still looking shell-shocked, Everyone expected Miles to say something cutting, something that would put Herbie in his place while still acknowledging that the take worked. Instead, Miles leaned against the piano and spoke quietly, so only Herbie and the musicians closest to them could hear clearly. "There are no wrong notes," Miles said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "There are only the notes you play after the wrong notes that matter." Herbie looked up at him, not quite understanding. Miles continued, speaking in that distinctive, raspy voice that commanded attention even at low volume. "You played a chord you didn't mean to play. You thought it was wrong. Everyone else thought it was wrong. But I heard it, and I heard where it could go. The note isn't wrong by itself. It's only wrong if you don't know what to do next." Miles straightened up and addressed the whole room now, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades thinking deeply about music and art and creativity. "Every note you play suggests possibilities," he said. "Even the ones you didn't intend. Maybe especially the ones you didn't intend. Your job as a musician isn't to only play the right notes. It's to listen to what's happening and respond honestly." Herbie played something unexpected. I responded. The music went somewhere new. That's not a mistake. That's conversation. He turned back to Herbie. "Don't ever apologize for taking the music somewhere I didn't expect. That's what I want. That's what makes it alive. What I can't stand is musicians who are so afraid of being wrong that they never take any risks at all. Those musicians are technically perfect and completely dead." The words hung in the studio air like a benediction. Herbie felt something shift inside him, not just about that specific moment, but about his entire understanding of what music was supposed to be. But Miles wasn't done. He had one more thing to say, and this part would become one of the most quoted pieces of wisdom in jazz history. "The mistakes are the good part," Miles said, "because that's where you find out who you really are as a musician. Anyone can play the notes on the page, but when something unexpected happens, when you hit a note you didn't mean to hit, that's when you discover whether you're really listening, whether you're really present, whether you can think fast enough to turn a problem into a possibility." He tapped the piano once, a gesture of finality. "So don't feel bad about that chord. That chord taught everyone in this room something. It taught them that the music is more important than being right. And that's a lesson worth learning." The session continued. They recorded several more takes that day, but the one they kept, the one that became the final version on Kind of Blue, was the take with Herbie's wrong chord. And when you listen to it now, knowing the story, you can hear it. You can hear the moment where Herbie's chord creates a tension, and you can hear Miles's response, turning that tension into something transcendent. Kind of Blue went on to sell over 5 million copies. It's been called the greatest jazz album ever recorded. Music students study it in universities. It's in the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry. And embedded in one of its most famous tracks is a mistake that became one of its most beautiful moments. But the impact of what happened that day went far beyond one album. Herbie Hancock took Miles's lesson and carried it with him for the next 6 decades of his musical career. He would go on to win 14 Grammy Awards, an Academy Award, and become one of the most innovative and influential musicians of the 20th century. And in every interview he gave, in every masterclass he taught, Herbie told the story of the wrong chord. He told it to young musicians who were terrified of making mistakes. He told it to students who were so obsessed with technical perfection that they'd forgotten to feel the music. He told it to anyone who needed to hear that the creative process isn't about avoiding errors. It's about embracing the unexpected and finding the possibilities within it. Miles's philosophy about wrong notes spread throughout the jazz world and beyond. It influenced rock musicians in the 1960s who were experimenting with new sounds. It influenced composers who started building wrong notes into their pieces intentionally. It influenced educators who began teaching students that mistakes could be learning opportunities rather than failures. The story became legendary in music circles. Other musicians who played with Miles confirmed it. This was how he worked. He didn't want perfection. He wanted presence. He wanted musicians who were brave enough to take risks and smart enough to respond when things didn't go as planned. In 2008, almost 50 years after that recording session, Herbie Hancock was giving a talk at a music festival. Someone in the audience asked him what the most important lesson he'd ever learned. Herbie didn't even pause. "Miles taught me that there are no wrong notes," he said. "And that changed everything, not just for me but for how I understand creativity itself. Because once you're not afraid of being wrong, you're free to be truly original. And once you're free to be truly original, you can create something that nobody has ever heard before." He paused, remembering that day in the studio, that moment of terror that became a moment of revelation. "People ask me all the time how to become a great musician," Herbie continued. "They want to know how many hours to practice, what techniques to master, what theory to study, and all of that matters. But none of it matters as much as learning to listen, really listen to what's happening in the moment, and being brave enough to respond honestly, even if your response isn't what you planned." The lesson from that studio in 1959 became one of the foundational principles of modern jazz, that authenticity matters more than perfection, that the ability to respond matters more than the ability to plan, and that sometimes the most beautiful moments come from what we didn't intend. Miles Davis died in 1991, but his philosophy lives on in every music school, every recording studio, every rehearsal space where musicians gather to create something new. And embedded in one of the greatest albums ever recorded is a reminder that genius isn't about never making mistakes. It's about knowing what to do when you make them. Herbie Hancock is now 84 years old. He's played thousands of concerts, recorded dozens of albums, worked with everyone from rock stars to classical orchestras to hip-hop artists, and he still occasionally hits wrong notes. But now, when it happens, he doesn't freeze. He listens. He responds. He turns the unexpected into something new. Because Miles Davis taught him, Neo's taught all of us, that there are no wrong notes. There's only the music we make with what happens, and the courage we have to embrace the unexpected. If this story about turning mistakes into masterpieces resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold stories about the creative genius behind music's greatest legends. Have you ever had a mistake turn into something better than you planned? Share your story in the comments below and hit that notification bell for more true stories about the humanity and wisdom behind the artists who changed how we hear the world.